This week on Inside Olympia, for the first time in a decade, the state of Washington faces a yawning budget shortfall. How big is it, and how will lawmakers close the gap? On the program, Senate Ways and Means Chair June Robinson and Ranking Republican Chris Gildon. Plus, we check in with our reporters panel.
From the TVW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
And welcome to Inside Olympia and Happy New Year. Washington's 2025 105-day budget writing legislative session is officially underway, and it's a year of change. A new governor after 12 years, a large budget shortfall for the first time in nearly that long that lawmakers will have to address. But other things haven't changed. Democrats are still large and in charge of Olympia. Vexing issues like homelessness, a lack of affordable housing, and inadequate behavioral health services continue to challenge the state. There are also looming challenges like where the energy of the future will come from in an increasingly electrified world. In our second half, we'll break down the hot issues with our reporters panel. But first, the budget. How big is the budget gap? What will it take to solve it? And how will lawmakers work with incoming Governor Bob Ferguson, who is signaling a desire to take perhaps a harder line on spending? Joining me now is State Senator June Robinson, the Democratic chair of the Senate Ways and Means, or Budget Committee, and Senator Chris Gildon, the ranking Republican, the new ranking Republican on that committee. Good to see both of you. Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Happy first week of session. Mm-hmm. Congratulations on the new position on this committee, Senator Gildon. Let's start with the problem statement and a little bit of historical context. Before we started, we were talking about the fact that neither of you were here the last time in the legislature, the last time the state faced a budget challenge of this size and scope. So how big is the problem and how much of a shock to the system is this, Chair Robinson?
Well, thank you, and thanks for having me. It's a big problem. It is quite a shock. It's going to take a lot of work to find our way to a balanced budget by the end of April. I use the figure $12 billion. That's over four.
4 years.
We are required by law to balance over 4 years, and so that is the figure that I'm using. There are a lot of different figures floating around, but I think people have pretty much settled on that as the size of the problem.
Senator Gildon, what number are you using, and is this a shock to your system, to Senate Republicans?
Well, no, and I think, thank you for that question, because it's a really relevant question is what is the size of the budget? Because the first step in the problem-solving process is you have to clearly identify the problem that you're trying to solve. Otherwise, you're going to provide the wrong solution. And we've certainly heard numbers from, starting out about a month ago, $4.5 to $5 billion, and then it jumped to $7 or $8 billion. Department of Commerce is saying 10 to 12. And recently, Governor Inslee is saying maybe 15 or so. So what is the size and scope of that budget deficit that we're trying to fill? And I don't think that we've come to resolution on that quite yet. One of the things that we did do, though, is we did reach out to the nonpartisan staff in the legislature, and we asked them, what is the scope of the problem? What are we actually dealing with here? And these are people who don't have a political agenda, but they are certainly experts with the state budget. And their response back to us was that it was a $6.7 billion shortfall of the maintenance level, so the daily operations of the government, over the course of 4 years. And I think that's probably about the most accurate number that we have. But we're going to go into negotiations later today, and we'll start figuring out what is the actual number that we're dealing with.
So, Senator Robinson, what would account for that variance or that gap? If nonpartisan staff are telling Senator Gildon that it's maybe $6.5 billion, where would we get to 12 or even 15 billion? What's not being included or factored in there? Is it the collective bargaining agreements that haven't been agreed upon yet or haven't been signed off on yet, or something else?
That is definitely a significant portion of that difference is collective bargaining agreements, which we expect we will include in the final budget.
And remind us, that's a significant chunk of money in the billions.
It's billions, three, I believe.
Kind of comes to mind.
Mm-hmm.
So you you have to figure out, and by the way, you will budget based on the next revenue forecast. Comes in, is it February, March? Can't now remember.
February.
And is there even a later one that
No,
will
I'm
allow you-
sorry. It's in March.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the numbers you're working with are kind of preliminary now. You'll have a better set of numbers a little bit later on. But here's the thing that I think I want to wrestle with a little bit too is I have seen downturns in the economy where state revenues were in the negatives, right? Like we were growing and now we're not growing. The difference here is that you still actually have overall projected revenue growth, but you have spending outpacing that growth, and that's where the gap comes from. So in that sense, it's not necessarily like a classic budget crisis. And in some ways, it's like, help people get their head around this. Well, how can we be having a budget crisis or a budget problem if the revenues are still growing? $5 billion more in revenue growth, I think is what I saw.
Revenues are growing. We do have a good economy here in Washington State. They are growing more slowly than we anticipated. And just like every household, every business is facing inflation, the state services and the state budget is also facing inflationary pressures, which are outpacing the revenue growth that we've seen. There are policies that we put in place in previous biennia that now are coming online, that are growing.
The term of art down here is bow wave.
Bow wave.
So give us an example, because I'm really interested in this. What are one or two examples of the largest bow wave programs? What's driving costs on that side?
One that has stood out is in 2021, we passed what we called Fair Starts for Kids Act, which really increased state resources towards early learning,
3 and 4
ECAP,
year-olds.
and Working Connections childcare, state subsidized childcare for working families. And we put initial investments in 2021, and then in that bill, which is enacted, we voted for it, it grew over time. And so when Senator Gildon talks about maintenance level, things that are in statute are what make up maintenance level. And so some of those policies that we put in place are set to come online here in this biennia, and it turns out they are much more expensive than we anticipated in 2021.
Okay. Well, Senator Gildon, let's go back to the base question, which is, okay, revenues are growing, and yet we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar budget shortfall over 2 and 4 years. How do we get here? Why is this happening?
Yeah, this is a shortfall unlike we've ever really seen because, like you said, about $5 billion more in revenue this next budget cycle than we had in the last budget cycle.
So just to be clear, because it gets confusing, 2 and 4 years, the number you're talking about, as you understand it, we'll have $5 billion more to work with in the next 2-year budget.
Correct. Yeah.
2-year budget. Okay.
And then, and we also have low unemployment in our state. Yeah. The economy is doing really good. So what is driving this particular shortfall? And I'll tell you, it's not caseload, right? Because the operating budget typically funds 3 large areas. We fund things that educate, things that medicate, and things that incarcerate. And if you look at any one of those, the number of students in our K-12 public education, it hasn't grown overwhelmingly since the pandemic. The number of people on state Medicaid, it's not really high. And we certainly know that our state prisons are not bursting at the seams with new people occupying those beds. So really, caseload is not what's driving this. What it's driving it is what Senator Robinson spoke to a little bit ago, is the legislature a few years back basically put a number of bills on layaway. Mm-hmm. They said, we want to pass these bills. We're not ready to pay for it yet, but we'll just pay for it in the future. And now it's time to pay the bills, and there's not sufficient money to cover it.
I want to do a little bit of Monday morning quarterbacking, and Democrats have been in charge for a number of years now. You look at the spending growth in the state over the last several biennia, and it's been double-digit growth, significant double-digit growth. According to the Senate Republican Caucus, 18% growth in the 2017-19 budget, 19% growth the next 2-year budget, 18.5% 21-23, and continued on in the 2023-25. Now, I know Democrats will argue that a lot of that was fully funding education as required by the McCleary decision and building back from cuts that were made during the Great Recession. But I also think probably anybody could agree that you're growing the budget at a pace that's probably not long-term sustainable. I mean, 20% growth, you're not going to have revenues to match that. So what was the thinking? What's the defense of the spending increases over the last several years?
Yeah, well, you talked about two big drivers. The first two biennia that you spoke of there, 17 to 19 and 19 to 21, we were still investing billions of dollars in K-12 to bring us out of the McCleary lawsuit and to respond to our paramount duty per the state's constitution around K-12 education. So that was what was going on in those big increases. And then, we really just finished that, and we had the COVID pandemic when we did invest a lot in resources for people who had lost jobs, had to figure out how to live through this pandemic, and we had revenue at that time to do what we did. So, people are going to criticize the decisions that we made. That's their prerogative. We did what I felt was responsible at the time in responding to the needs of Washingtonians, and we had revenue to support it.
On the flip side, Senator Gildon, there's also a huge amount of investment in behavioral health, which was very bipartisan in nature, and I don't recall, and you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, the same sort of hue and cry opposition from Republicans to a lot of the spending increases that maybe historically we would have seen, that there seemed to be bipartisan support. Yeah, we need to do more for education. Yeah, we're going to invest in a big way, billions of dollars more into behavioral health. These are challenges that transcend partisanship. So I guess the question is, how critical are you of the spending practices of the last several years? Or would you be of the position that, we were operating under sort of a certain set of circumstances then, and now we need to change the way we've been operating, but less recriminations for the past?
And I did vote for the operating budget the last 2 years in a row, right? However, the last 2 years in a row did not include any new tax increases as well. I think a lot of this stems from, I think it was 2021, whenever we had, it was a $12 or a $15 billion budget surplus. And the legislature pretty much spent all of that, and some of that is what's created the bow wave that we're dealing with now. And I distinctly remember Republicans at the time, specifically Representative Drew Stokesbury, warning that we need to be very judicious in how we spend this windfall because it's going to create issues for us in the future. So I think Republicans have been sounding the cry about this for quite a while. But the bottom line is we're in the situation we're in now, and we've got to work together to figure out a way ahead of it.
Well, as the outgoing governor likes to say, this is the soup you're in. So now you got to figure out how to solve the problem. So let's start to transition to that. What does a solution look like? Again, Democrats are in charge, have very large majorities. There's already been quite a lot of talk, and frankly, again, to sort of the ear that's been around this place for a while, I've been a little bit surprised how quickly the conversation has gone to revenues. There's proposals that have been floated around by the Senate Democratic Caucus, and the House Democrats have talked about this. So when you think about the combination of, and we'll get to what Republicans think and what the new incoming governor thinks, but when you think about the combination, and I know it's early days yet, what's your gut instinct? Where are you headed and leading as the chair of this committee in terms of a solution?
Well, thank you. I mean, we have to keep the overarching framework of what is our state budget in mind, and that is to fund the needs of the people in the state of Washington. But we have to do that in a responsible, balanced way. So We will initially go through the budget with pretty line by line and look for places that we can reduce spending, whether that's eliminating some programs that maybe haven't come online yet or are not working as intended, reducing others, finding places where we budgeted but money is not being spent as intended. So that exercise will be happening starting today. And at the same time, as I started saying, we have to think about what it is that we responsibly need to fund to keep our state moving forward, to keep people healthy, educated, and keep state government functioning. So as we look at where can we find reductions, savings, cuts? What do we need to fund in order to keep us going forward? And then where is that? What is that delta? I mean, I do think at the end of the day, we're going to need some sort of additional revenue to fill that gap. What that number is, I have no idea today.
And what that mechanism is.
Correct.
Too early
Yeah.
to say.
Right.
Even though there's a lot of ideas floating around.
Right.
Okay, Senator Gildon, as the ranking Republican on this Ways and Means Committee, obviously you don't have a vote that is a majority vote, but what are we going to be hearing from Senate Republicans when it comes to how you start to tackle and balance this problem?
Yeah, and Senate Republicans are going to be working earnestly and honestly to find genuine ways to assist with this problem. I'll be in the room with Senator Robinson and a couple of others as we start developing the budget. We were able to come up with bipartisan budgets over the last 2 years. Depending on how everything works out this year, we'll see, right? But I think what you can expect from Senate Republicans is an earnest examination of spending and where we can actually find some savings. And I'll give you 3 examples, Austin. The first thing is one of the fastest growing line items in our budget comes in the form of tort liability. That's tortuous conduct, bad conduct by state employees that's been adjudicated for a monetary amount. And over the last 2 years, we've seen that has been, I think, $500 million in the last 2 years that the state has paid out in tort claims. Now, that's more money than we've paid out in our entire state history prior to Governor Inslee assuming office. That's a lot of money. And I really think that the legislature needs to have some oversight of that. Perhaps, and I've dropped a bill on this, perhaps the legislature needs to have oversight hearings on any tort claims above $1 million, for example. But we need to exercise that oversight. Another one is in the area of Medicaid. You may not know this, but in the last couple of years, we've paid out about $135 million for what's called concurrent enrollment in Medicaid. So that's when a person is enrolled in Medicaid in Washington State, they move to another state, enroll in that state's Medicaid, and now both states are paying the monthly premiums. $135 million, and we can't recoup it after we've already paid it. I certainly believe that the agency needs to go back and renegotiate that contract, and we're going to be providing a bill to direct them to do that because it's kind of it's a waste of taxpayer dollars. And then I'll give you one more example of where we can genuinely save some dollars, and there's some policy differences on this, but it has to do with the age at which a person goes to juvenile detention as opposed to the Department of Corrections. And, I understand the argument about brain age and maturity, and they say that people are not mature until the age of 25. That's a separate discussion, but budgetary-wise, juvenile detention costs about $260,000, $270,000 per year per individual. Department of Corrections cost about $60,000 or $70,000 per individual. So whenever you're looking at that, for every 5 people that we move from juvenile detention to the Department of Corrections, you're looking at saving about $1 million. Those are real dollars over time. And so that's just a sampling of some of the things that you can expect from Senate Republicans this year.
In current policy, the state is keeping people up to 25. If they started in JRA and juvenile rehabilitation, they stay in juvenile rehabilitation until age 25.
Yeah, correct.
So, Senator Robinson, those are some very concrete, specific, perhaps policy areas where Republicans would like to see a change, not just in spending, but save money by changing policy. And I'm sure that there will be some disagreement around some of those ideas. But what about, we're hearing so much, let me go all the way back to the Gary Locke era when there were budget shortfalls that pale in comparison, at least from a dollar amount and probably from a percentage amount too. And he did zero-based budgeting, priorities of government. We're obviously hearing a ton of conversation in the context of the incoming presidential administration about government efficiency, right? And a number of Republican-led states are embracing that and creating their own DOGE entities to try to look for ways to scrub the budget. Is there any talk at this point about something more aggressive or fulsome than just, as you say, going line by line by the budget?
I don't hear a lot of talk about zero-based budgeting. I really trust and rely on our nonpartisan staff that help us a lot through the budget development process. And, they spend the entire year looking at expenses and the ways that the agencies that they're working with are spending money or not spending money. And those same nonpartisan staff have created a document that is many pages, dozens of pages long of potential reductions. So it's not exactly zero-based budgeting, but it has been their responsibility over the last few months to really scrub, that seems to be a popular word right now, their part of the budget and come up with any idea that they can possibly think of that would result in reductions. And we will be working our way through that very long list.
Let me get a sense of, let's bring in this incoming governor, Bob Ferguson, and some of his early rhetoric, which was to throw cold water on the idea of a wealth tax, which the outgoing governor included in his budget proposal, and is a leading idea for progressive groups. And he announced 6% across the board cuts with some exceptions. He wants to hold harmless some elements of government, including K-12, which is like about half the budget. To my ear, again, I think sounds like there might be some daylight between this incoming Democratic governor and what legislative Democrats are thinking. What are you hearing?
I was not surprised by Governor-elect Ferguson's budget outline and principles.
He said taxes need to be a last resort.
Right. And I don't have a problem with that. As I described earlier, we will do all of the exercise of reducing first. And we are not running to pass big taxes. I still maintain that at the end of the day, there will need to be some tax increases in order to, again, do what the people that brought us here expect us to do to keep our state moving forward.
So I want to hear what you think about what the incoming governor is saying, but it also reminds me that I don't think we finished the question of, so you were proposing, I asked you what will Republicans be doing here and trying to help solve this problem. You said, we'll work with Democrats, we might even be in the room up to a point. What if they do go the route of revenue? Is that a non-starter for Senate Republicans, or is that a conversation you're willing to have just at a later date?
I think it's way premature. Like I started out in this conversation, the first step in the problem-solving process is to clearly identify the problem. We haven't gotten beyond that first step yet. So I think it's a little premature to start talking about revenue at this point. I will say I am very encouraged by what Governor-elect Ferguson has been saying. He seems to be saying all of the right things. And, I think he has a really great opportunity for success early on in his administration. As a former Army officer, when I would go take over a unit, I always hoped it was like a mediocre performing unit. It wasn't like a top-notch performing unit, because then that always gave me room for some quick successes, right? And I think Governor-elect Ferguson has some room for some really quick successes, whether that's in our state's affordability crisis, whether that's in the state's opioid addiction and overdose crisis, whether it evolves around fixing potholes in the road, where we have the most potholes per mile of any state in the union. He has a lot of opportunity for early success, and I think that this budget could give him another opportunity to achieve success as well. And so long as he does those things, he can certainly expect to have the support of Senate Republicans. As long as he's, staying true to his word, we'll be right there rooting for his success.
In the few minutes we have left, I want to click through some specific programs and areas and get your kind of take on things. The first will be K-12 education. It is the paramount duty of the state. After the last down payment or last payment on McCleary was achieved, the state was back up to about half its budget going to K-12. That's now slipped, I think if I read correctly, in the Seattle Times, under the outgoing governor's proposed budget, it slips to like 41 or 42 or 43% of the budget. So 2 questions about that. Do you agree with Governor-elect Ferguson that K-12 should be spared spending cuts? And then the second part of that is, should you be working to have it be a greater percentage than it is right now, or at least hold the line on the percentage that it is of the state overall budget? What's your position on that?
What was the first part
Well,
of the
just
question?
the holding the line, not cutting, hold harmless.
Right. I agree with that. That's not
But
to
it wouldn't be subject to the 6% cuts.
Correct. I mean, because it is our paramount duty, and I think everyone considers it protected in the state budget. Again, there are probably small things within K-12 funding that we can look at, and perhaps it's a grant program that's outlasted its usefulness, or things change as we move along. So there may be small things that we can reduce, but generally, it is such a large part of the budget, you're not going to see major reductions there. I do think that the measure of what percent of the overall budget is a false narrative. Are we funding K-12 to the extent that every child has the opportunity for a quality education? That should be the.
What do you think the answer to that question is?
I think that we, in some cases, are falling short. We hear loudly from school districts. I have a school district that I represent that is in very serious financial conditions. And many of them are finding it challenging to continue to provide the education that our communities expect.
So, Senator Gildon, to that same point, I mean, I'm sure you're hearing it from your school districts too. Here, you've got this budget problem, paramount duty, public education. Governor-elect Ferguson saying, well, at least, we're not going to do the 6% across-the-board cuts, but these districts are saying, we need help. We need you to actually step up your investment.
They do need help, especially in terms of what we call maintenance supplies and operating costs. That's their insurance, their electric bill, things like that have just gone through the roof in recent years. And one of the things that I've said to my school districts is help me help you, right? Because I know that the legislature is really, really good at giving mandates to school districts or to cities or counties, but the legislature is very bad at removing those mandates once they become obsolete, ineffective, or no longer of use. And so the thing that I've asked my school districts in my city and my county is take a look at all of the mandates that the state puts on you, whether it's something as simple as a reporting requirement, which takes feasibly a full-time employee to fulfill the mandate of the report. Whatever it is, if it's no longer useful, if it's past its lifespan, let us know so we can remove that requirement from you and ease your burden. We may not be able to give you a lot of additional money, but perhaps we can free up a lot of money that you already get.
Do you see any opportunity to increase spending on special education or other interventions for students that are struggling?
Special education funding is a priority for my caucus. Where we're going to end up with that at the end of April, I can't say today, but it is certainly something we will be looking seriously at.
I also want to ask you about 2 other proposals. One, Governor-elect Ferguson supports and wants to fund, which is making school lunches, school meals free for all students. And I think there's bipartisan support for this and actually quite a lot of public support, but it's not cheap. It's like $120 million a year.
It's actually much more than that.
my number's wrong.
It's very expensive.
So what's your thinking on that? Do
I
you have a dollar amount off the top of your head?
don't.
Okay. But it's a lot of money. Yeah.
It's hundreds of millions of dollars, yeah.
Like to do it? Hard to do it?
It's very popular. It's very sympathetic. Everybody wants to make sure kids have food to eat. I think we're going to need to weigh that with other investments and see where we end up.
Are you in agreement on that one?
I agree. Our budget ought to reflect the priorities. Obviously, school children not being hungry at school is a high priority, right? But then additionally, should, some single mother who's struggling to make ends meet have additional tax dollars go to pay for a free school lunch for a rich kid, a child of rich parents on Mercer Island, for example. So I think we need to be a little nuanced whenever we talk about these issues.
$100 million more for policing, again, something the governor-elect wants. Is there money in the budget to do that?
Not today.
Not today.
There will be.
Okay. Early learning was going to be an entitlement program. It's what we talked about early on at the bow wave. What's the reality check about expanding and continuing to increase funding in early education and child care subsidies?
The reality check is we're going to need to slow that down. It is more expensive than we anticipated, so certainly for that reason. There's also a workforce issue with early learning and childcare, and the practitioners themselves have said, please slow this down. We cannot hire enough people to continue to ramp up in the way that we had anticipated. So we have work to do as a state to get us to the point of every child being able to access quality early learning.
One more question for the chair. Last session in your committee, the 7% rate cap, rent cap failed. The makeup of your committee has changed. I know this is a priority of House Democrats. They're going to move that bill early. How likely is it to move out of your committee this year when it gets there? And again, this is a controversial measure.
Yes.
Republicans don't like it.
I have not done a vote count. I think it has a better chance than it had last year.
Okay. We are out of time. I want to give you each an opportunity to make a closing statement. I've been starting with you, so let me start with Senator Gildon.
Yeah, sure. No, thank you for the time and the opportunity to come here and talk about these important issues. Certainly, our state is facing a budget shortfall. What exactly that number is, we're still going to have to come to resolution. Once we do that, then we'll start applying solutions to fix the problem. But certainly, our budget must reflect our priorities of public safety, affordability, the health, welfare, and education of our children. I think those are our top priorities regarding the state's operating budget. And you can certainly expect Senate Republicans to give an honest, genuine effort to help us achieve savings, real savings, over the course of the legislative session. We're going to be dropping a trail of breadcrumbs leading to savings all throughout session. And should the majority party decide to pick up a few of those crumbs, then we will certainly support that.
And worth noting to the public that at least as we start this session, there is a working relationship between the two parties and the two caucuses. Not true in all states. A final word to the chair.
Thank you, and thanks for having this conversation today on the first day of session. And I'm very glad that I have a partner like Senator Gildon to work with. We certainly will look at and consider all proposals that come from anyone. But at the end of the day, we have to write a budget, balance a budget that reflects the needs and priorities of the people that we represent, and one that will pass the Senate, pass the House, and be signed by our new governor.
Pass muster with the new governor, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Chair Robinson, Ranking Committee Member Gildon, thank you for your time. Good luck. I know it's going to be a tough session. Appreciate your time and look forward to a follow-up conversation. And when we return, we will forecast other elements of the session ahead with our reporters panel. Back right after this.
Hearing terminology like level 1, 2, and 3 evacuations, that's somewhat of a foreign term on this side of the state.
We're waiting on engine 5-9.
The ability for us to stop all forest fires, it's just not realistic.
And welcome back to Inside Olympia. So what can we expect over the next 100 plus days as the legislature meets in Olympia? We know there's a budget challenge to address, there's a new governor, many new faces in the legislature, and lots of ongoing long-term challenges facing the state. To break this down and to do a bit of future casting, we invited two members of the Capitol Press Corps to join us. Here now is Shauna Sowersby of the Seattle Times and Laurel Demkovich of the Washington State Standard. Great to see you both.
Good to see you.
Shauna, congratulations on your new role with the Seattle Times, previously with Cascade PBS, and even before that with McClatchy. You're both now veterans of the Capitol beat. And I just, out of the gates, I want to ask you both for your impressions just in this first week, given the kind of tone and tenor of things and what we're hearing from Governor-elect Ferguson, the perhaps tensions that are already emerging between the incoming governor and at least the progressive wing of the Democrats. But I guess the bottom line is it seems like there's a new sheriff in town, and it might get interesting.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, Bob Ferguson obviously is not new to the state government. No. He's been around for...
Three-term attorney general.
Yes, right. Exactly. But, I think there were a lot of questions about what he was going to come in and do. Even on the campaign trail, a lot of his policy ideas were a little bit vague, I guess. And so, he's already come in at this point and said, Governor Inslee released a budget proposal, that's fine, but this is actually what I want to do. And this is, I'm in charge now, basically. And I think that dynamic is going to be really interesting as we see legislators try to deal with him and try to work together to solve, as you already mentioned, kind of a growing budget crisis.
Well, and you remind me, that was the other thing, is that the contrast between the incoming governor and the outgoing governor. I mean, Ferguson poured cold water on Governor Inslee's proposal for a wealth tax. He said taxes are going to kind of be a last resort. He proposed across-the-board cuts to a number of state agencies. Shauna, I'm curious, what are you hearing in terms of reaction to this? I know that there's a kind of a pro-revenue group that's already saying, we got to start hitting hard early this idea of raising taxes, but how is this being received?
I think for some of the progressives that voted for Bob Ferguson in his campaign, it seems like a lot of them are pretty shocked that he is not going along with Governor Inslee's proposal to incorporate a wealth tax. It seemed, from what I have seen, what I've read so far, it seems like a lot of the more conservative folks are pleased with Ferguson's proposal. I think they probably thought he was going to go along with what the progressives in the Democratic caucus were saying. It should be interesting to see how it plays out.
I am curious if there's, I keep thinking gosh, is there a lot of daylight between Ferguson and legislative Democrats? And I suppose we don't really know yet because that relationship is just getting going. And there's a little bit of a kind of dance, right? Because to your point, Laurel, Ferguson is well known, but he's well known in the context of being Attorney General. So this is new for for us as reporters. It's new for the legislators. Ferguson hasn't even taken. I guess this week he just took office, but he's been sort of the governor-elect for months now. So it's what is really going to transpire here? But do you have a sense of what that relationship is starting to look like? Do you think there's going to be friction? Do you think it's going to be uncomfortable?
Yeah, I to be honest, I don't really have a sense at this point, I think. We've already seen, kind of as we've mentioned, legislative Democrats have been saying for the last month, we need new taxes. Some of them have even gotten behind a wealth tax specifically. So I think
they've floated a lot of different tax proposals.
Yeah. And so I don't know how much of what he said last week was a surprise to them as well. If they're just kind of playing it off as, we've been meeting with him, we've been working with him. And a question that I have had and I don't necessarily have an answer to yet is, how much has his transition team actually been meeting with lawmakers up until now? And I don't fully know the answer to that.
Shauna, what is your sense of the sort of dynamic going into this 2025 session, not just with a new governor, but there's a new Senate Majority Leader in Jamie Peterson. There are a number of new, fresh faces to the state legislature. And there's also the reality that a huge percentage of even the incumbent legislators have never experienced a budget shortfall of this nature. And so again, like new keeps, that just seems to be, and you start layering that in. It's like, this is going to be interesting.
Yeah, seems to be the theme this year
Yeah.
is new everything. Yeah, I mean, I'm really curious, particularly, I'll just give rent stabilization as an example. I don't think that Andy Billig, when he was Senate Majority Leader, had as much appetite for that type of bill. That's why we didn't see as much movement on it. Jamie Peterson just the other day mentioned that, yes.
And he's, by the way,
Senate-
the new Senate Majority Leader. Yeah.
Yes, he mentioned that there is an appetite for it. He has the appetite for it in the Senate. So just from that alone, that's one dynamic that we're already going to see that's going to change moving forward that we haven't seen in previous years.
Yeah, that's a very good example, and it's interesting to think. I mean, I didn't think of Andy Billig as a super moderate. On the other hand, he was a Spokane Democrat, and now you've got Jamie Peterson as the Senate Majority Leader coming from one of the most progressive districts in the state. And the other part of this is that the legislature has also grown more progressive over the years and up to and including this last election. So some real tension points. Where does this leave Republicans? I mean, especially now that Democrats have 60% majorities in each chamber. It's interesting having just had the conversation with the budget chair and the top Republican. There seem to be good relations at this point, conversation. It sounds like the Senate typically invites the Republicans in, but clearly they're not going to need their votes to pass a budget. And if there are taxes on the table, it's unlikely they're going to get any Republican votes. So where do you think that leaves Republicans?
Yeah, I mean, to your point, I think however much discussion they have now, I think some of that tends to maybe go out the window when we get like final proposals. A lot of times we'll hear from Republicans, at least in the House, who will say we were not involved in any of these discussions. So,
Right.
However much they're talking now, that maybe will or will not be true. But I will say, there are some things that they might need Republican votes for. They don't quite have 60% in the Senate, I believe. And so, if they want to take the rainy day fund, for example, they're going to need Republican votes for that. I believe there's some, or at least in Inslee's budget, there was some talk of pension sweeps as well, which I believe would also need some of their
so I think
support.
my understanding is that they could do, at 60% you can do bonding, but for anything that's going to require a two-thirds vote, you're right, that they still would need Republicans. And I guess it's just how much more sort of marginalized the minority are Republicans versus how much can they fulsomely be part of the conversations, because we have seen Republicans, even in their minority status, very involved in the conversations around behavioral health, very involved in housing conversations, supportive of a lot of the spending. I mean, Senator Gildon even acknowledged that he'd voted for the last couple of budgets.
Yeah, and I think too, we're seeing maybe the Republicans are kind of seeing exactly where they stand and what they can get passed. One of the proposals that they have out on the table that they keep talking about this year is the proposal to eliminate taxes from diapers. So I think they're kind of tackling some of these issues in a way that they're trying to pass things that they can get Democratic support for, things that they know that they can get support on these other things with. So they are left to introduce things that they haven't before.
Is there any sense yet of where the tax conversation goes? And again, I know it's early, but you had Governor Inslee embracing the wealth tax, Governor Ferguson seeming to be not interested in that. And he did say that he thought it was starting a new tax was risky, and even Speaker Jenkins has indicated that if you are going to impose a tax to solve a here and now budget problem, you have to know you're going to get revenue off of it pretty quickly, that it's not going to be tied up in the courts. But this Senate tax document leaked before the holidays that had a menu of options. Any sense of, besides the wealth tax, what the leading ideas are or where this conversation goes? Because as we've noted, at least the progressive wing of the party and their backers are going to want to have that conversation front and center from day one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure, honestly. The wealth tax, I think, is the one that has kind of that I've at least heard the most about at this point, even like talking to advocates for, various things, childcare, housing, kind of all of these specific topics. They'll end a lot of their conversations with me at this point saying, we need some sort of progressive revenue. We're not doing it right now, whether it's a wealth tax or something else, that's what a lot of them want. But as you mentioned, Speaker Jenkins has said to me, we want something that's going to be, very quick litigation, because a lot of times any tax proposal will probably go to court. So they want it to be done quickly, and they want the money now.
Yesterday, right?
Yeah.
Well, and they did the capital gains tax in the context of, if I remember correctly, not needing it in the same way for a budget problem. Now, it sounds like I think it was Senator Peterson, Majority Leader Peterson, suggested that Ferguson might be interested in some sort of surcharge on the wealthiest businesses. There's some precedent for that. I think we do that now in large banks. Have you heard anything more on that, Shauna? Or even if not, how did that, when that was mentioned, what was going through your mind?
Yeah, I haven't heard too much on that. I know that Peterson also mentioned the other day that there are ideas that the Democrats are currently working on that they have not even introduced yet, that they're just kind of being talked about. So those haven't even been presented to the public yet. So it seems like they're mulling over multiple issues kind of behind the scenes before they really introduce some of that stuff to the public.
Well, let's talk about some of the policy issues that are going to face this legislature. Housing and homelessness continue to loom large. Everybody acknowledges we're not building enough new units fast enough, and our homelessness numbers are, off the charts. What do you anticipate this session? Is it just more of the same of trying to sort of chip away at it?
Yeah, I think the biggest housing issue, at least at this point, I think Shauna's already mentioned it, is rent stabilization. That, was tried and failed last year, but we've already heard a lot of, or from a lot of senators that have said, I think that this is possible.
And the
this year.
dynamic has changed in the Senate.
Yeah.
And the makeup of the Ways and Means Committee, where it died last year, has changed. And again, this is the working proposal is the 7% cap on rent increases year over year.
Yeah, so I think that will definitely get a lot of traction. Probably, I don't want to predict, but it seems like at this point, some version of that will end up going through. But there is also a big push. We saw, in Ferguson's budget, for example, there was a big amount of money put into the Housing Trust Fund again to try to get more units up. Senator Peterson had mentioned to me, if we are going to pass rent stabilization, we still need to do more to get, supply up. We need to fast track permits. We need to find ways to just get more housing built. So I think that will still, remain to be a conversation.
Another topic that comes to mind, it's the paramount duty, and it's public education, and school districts are just clamoring. We're seeing school closures, we're seeing schools in budget crises, and we're also seeing outcomes that are very concerning, huge gaps between students of means and students of less means. I think the number I heard of 50% of kids who go from high school into college need remedial math and writing help, or at least writing help. And I'm already seeing the emails lobby your legislator for more funding for K-12 in a time of austerity. How do you think that's going to play, Shauna?
That is a good question. I particularly think it's really interesting that, Ferguson in his proposal kind of, didn't go after Inslee, but was just signaling that he's willing to go further than what Inslee was proposing.
Didn't he even say that the percentage of the budget that would go towards education in Inslee's budget was insufficient?
Correct. Yeah, he did say that. So I think that dynamic is really interesting. And hopefully, with Ferguson signaling that and kind of saying that, he's laying out what he expects of lawmakers to come back with before he'll sign off on it, at the end of session.
Any sense of, I saw an email this week, again, right out of the gates from the Alliance for Gun Responsibility, calling for more what they would call gun safety measures, including this proposal to require essentially licensure and training to buy a gun. Are you hearing, again, early days here, but are you hearing anything about the appetite? And by the way, one thing that Governor Ferguson has been very supportive of over the years are gun safety measures, even those that are, I mean, all of them have been hotly opposed by the gun rights advocates. So that's one area where he's willing to get into the fray, take a real position, and make the other side pretty angry. But any sense of where that conversation might be headed?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I was going to say was Governor-elect Ferguson is a huge proponent of these types of policies.
Yeah.
So if that...
He backed the assault weapon ban. I mean, it was his bill.
Yeah, I don't know if he's come out, and maybe Shauna, you know, if he's come out specifically on the permit to purchase proposal, but I could imagine that that is something he supports. I'm not entirely sure among lawmakers what the appetite is, but I can imagine, especially, you know, progressive lawmakers who want to get something done that doesn't cost a lot of money. That could be maybe not an easy win, but that is a win that they could get that wouldn't cost.
Yeah, and excuse me. You know, there's another proposal on the table right now. I think it's from Senator Valdez about prohibiting guns in more public spaces
Yes,
than we had
right.
before.
Expanding an existing law, which is perhaps an
Correct.
easier lift.
Yeah, exactly. And so we've seen the support for that in the past couple of years.
Yeah.
So, you know, stuff like that, I don't think will have any issue getting passed. Maybe the permit to purchase is going to be a little bit harder of a push, but, you know, I can certainly see expanding the prohibited areas for guns.
Am I remembering correctly that there's also a tax proposal for ammo?
There is,
Yeah,
yes.
right.
Yeah.
We talked in the first half exclusively about the operating budget, but there's also a very significant shortfall in the transportation budget. I believe the House Transportation Chair, Jake Fye, told me about $6 billion. And then that's despite the Climate Commitment Act surviving at the ballot. You know, remember, they were, you know, proponents were saying if that's repealed, that's going to leave a huge hole in the commitments that have been made in transportation. But even with that, they're saying it's a big gap. What are you hearing about what it will take to close that, or how many projects are imperiled now because of shortfalls? Either of you got an ear to the ground on transportation funding?
I'm not covering it super closely, but I know in the press preview that we had last week, leaders were asked a lot about a road usage charge because I think one of the big issues is the gas tax is just not
It's been
doing
eroding,
it anymore.
right?
Yeah.
And we've been saying this for a long time, but nobody's really come up with an alternative.
Yeah, and so I think they've studied the road usage charge forever. I believe it was Jake
I
Fye
think it
who
was
had
too.
mentioned he has a bill, I think, this session. I'm not sure entirely what's in it, if it is the full thing, but I think that will definitely be a conversation about dealing with the transportation budget, but who knows if that will make it to the finish line.
I'm really interested to see what happens with the .05 bill, lowering the BAC limit.
Yeah.
This is year 3, I think.
Right.
Senator Lovick is back with it again. You know, we often say in Olympia, you got to socialize big ideas or big change. Is it there yet? Will he get it across the finish line? I'm still skeptical, but he's clearly passionate and he's been working it for a while.
Yeah, that one's an interesting one too. Just I don't know, just seeing the push for that the last couple of years, kind of seemingly out of nowhere.
And it gets the liquor lobby and it gets the restaurateurs up
Right.
in arms. I mean, they
Right.
think it's not a good move. And even Republicans have expressed a little skepticism about how effective it. Utah did this. It's the only state to do it, and whether it's how effective it's been. Okay, we got to wrap up here. So just a final thought. I did put you in the hot seat here of trying to futurecast. You never really know where things are headed. But what did I miss, or what will you be watching for in the coming days? We'll start with you, Shauna.
I think the biggest thing I'm going to be watching for in the coming days is the lot splitting bill, wildly popular between progressive Democrats and conservative Republicans the last couple of years, just couldn't make it over the hurdle. So that is definitely one I will be keeping my eye on.
And that's
this
definitely
session.
all about housing density,
Yes.
bringing more houses into urban areas.
Right.
And by splitting lots. Okay, that's a good one.
Something I'm going to watch throughout session is just what happens with a lot of childcare and early learning funding. That, you know, there are big expansions planned over the next couple of years. That is something that's going to cost a lot of money that Inslee and others have already indicated is probably going to be paused. But there is still a push to get more provider pay and other things that can kind of happen on the childcare front despite those pauses. So we'll see. That's kind of a big part of the budget conversation right now.
Just in the few seconds we have left, what's the status of the Capitol Press Corps? There's a new report out just in the last week about diminishing coverage of Olympia. How many, do you have a sense yet of how many? There's some new WSU News Fellows, but do you know what the Capitol Press Corps is going to look like? How many?
That's a good question.
8, 10,
I was gonna say, I
11,
feel
12?
like there's
Maybe less than 10? Is
6
that
to 8
fair?
maybe
Yeah.
who are here all the time, and then the interns roaming around.
Let's just say outnumbered.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Laurel Demkovich, Shauna Sowersby, thanks so much for coming in. Good luck
you.
Thank you,
covering
Austin.
the session this year. Thank you for watching Inside Olympia. Next week, we'll talk taxes with the chair and ranking Republican of the House Finance Committee, and we'll check in with the state treasurer. I hope you tune in then. Thanks for watching.